Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, no force has ever had such an impact on local politics so quickly as Katrina. We'll be looking tonight at the high tide of changes brought about by the disaster and also ponder the political future. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Clancy Dubose, political editor, Gambit Weekly. And Gordon Russell, managing editor for Investigations, The New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go to Gordon first off, because recently you did a piece for The Advocate that sort of gave a good overview of what kind of political change has happened in New Orleans since the storm. Tell us what you found.
Well, there's a lot of ground to cover, of course, so it's hard to summarize quickly. But I guess the most obvious change that people talk about was sort of a rise in citizen engagement and activism, which isn't that surprising when people's homes and lives are at stake and when people are so angry about the things that went wrong, everything from the levees to the botched federal response to the botched local response to debates about whether we should bulldoze entire sections of town, whether we should allow people to rebuild. Obviously, these are the kinds of issues that will draw people out to public meetings and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of anger and a lot of unpleasant or difficult discussions that were had in those early days. But I think there's a positive way to look at it was that it drew people into the political process. And it did, some of these plans, for instance, the shrinking the footprint plan most famously was really driven back or beaten back by, very strong opposition from a lot of people. So I think that's the thing that is the big takeaway. I mean, I think we could go into a lot of other things, and I think we will talk about some of the other things that led to everything from crackdowns on corruption to some structural reforms in the system to electing different sorts of politicians. A lot of things probably grew out of that, and I think fast forwarding to the present, I guess one of the questions is whether that activism or that civic engagement is still with us. I think a lot of people feel that it is, but there are some signs in the other direction, like voting rates are actually down since compared to what they were pre-Katrina and things like that. So it's debatable whether, I think there's a feeling that we have a much more engaged populace than we used to, but I don't know if that's totally borne out by data.
What about organizational politics?
Right. So organizational politics were sort of, the old New Orleans way was the old New Orleans was sort of dominated by political organizations, chiefly black political organizations that were based in the neighborhoods, and you had the Morial family had was the standard bearer for the Life organization, and Bill Jefferson had the Progressive Democrats, and then you had the Coup organization in the 7th Ward. And you had Oliver Thomas and Jim Singleton sort of dominated the Bold organization, so on and so forth.
Soul in the Ninth Ward.
And these organizations were very influential in both sort of putting forward candidates for city council and eventually mayors and so forth. And they were sort of they would field a slate of candidates. They would pass out ballots. They had gigantic armies of street workers who would work election days. They were really sort of formidable organizations that had a lot of power. They were kind of on the wane, I would say, before Katrina. They were definitely on the wane. And Ray Nagin's election in 2002 was kind of a signal of how far they had fallen, I would say.
Yeah, Nagin was, in 2002, Ray Nagin was the white candidate for mayor in the runoff. Bill Jefferson's organization and many others backed Chief Pennington, who did not initially run as a Jefferson guy, but Jefferson kind of filled a void. But the organization's real political power came from the early days of civil rights when blacks were not accustomed to voting, and they didn't know these white guys who were running, because the city was white majority then, to when Dutch Morial got elected and blacks really became ascendant in political power. To the rise of the black middle class, which didn't need to be told or introduced to anybody, didn't need to be told who to vote for. They, like any middle class, black, white, Vietnamese, whatever, they could figure out all this on their own. So the black organizations in the 90s really started sliding. And when Nagin got elected in 2002, that was really kind of the last nail in the coffin of the black organizations. Ironically, after Katrina, when Nagin fell out of favor with white voters, I like to say he pulled an O.J. Simpson. He suddenly became very black, and became the black candidate for mayor and got elected in '06 in a cliffhanger election of sorts against Mitch Landrieu. And it looked like, you know, to some it might say, well, the black organizations came back. They really didn't. That was just
Right.
Nagin playing the race card, and it worked because the black community citywide and in every black neighborhood got hit really hard by Katrina, and there was a feeling among black voters and black civic and neighborhood leaders that I spoke to is, you know, we lost everything, but we're not going to lose the franchise. That term came into being in the political parlance of New Orleans, the franchise, which is the black community's ability to elect a black mayor, any black mayor. And Ray Nagin, they said he was any black mayor.
Well, one of the ironies about it, and which we discussed in that piece, was that, you know, in some sense, Ray Nagin let this genie out of the bottle of shrinking the footprint and some of the things that were very unpopular, and really, I think, created a sense, especially among blacks, that there were people who didn't want them to come back to the city, and Ray Nagin empowered people like Joe Canizero and other people on the Bring Back
The Urban Land Institute, that was
Bring New
their
Orleans
plan.
Back Commission, who were really pushing some of these ideas, and then Nagin sort of ran against those same ideas that he sort of introduced them into the public square, and then cleverly kind of ran against them and made an appeal to black voters that, you know, these people are trying to kind of take over the mayor's office, but also
Talked about the shadow government.
right, sort of keep you out. And this is.
But the other thing is, he got elected and then governed from that very model, not the anti, but from the top down. Well, I think if you could summarize how Katrina changed things, before Katrina, our politics were very much top down. In the immediate aftermath, and not only in '06, not so much the mayor's race, but the council races, and then even in 2010 in the council races, it was very much a bottom up. And to dovetail on what Gordon said, before Katrina, you mentioned all those black organizations, even though they were on the wane, they were still kind of a training ground, almost a political academy, as it were, for young African-American men and women to run for political office. After Katrina, right after Katrina, the city council went from 5-2 black-white to 5-2 white-black, I think. And it wasn't so much a racial change as it was, we suddenly, in this bottom-up theory, you had people, instead of coming from the political class, you had people coming from the civic and neighborhood organization and professional and business organization, mostly civic and neighborhood organizations. A majority of the city council in 2006 that was elected came from neighborhood organizations. And that hadn't happened since the 50s.
You know, a real key to the emergence of these black organizations, though, was the passage of the Voting Rights Bill. And that was, what, in '67, I believe, which was a year or two after
65, but
64,
yeah.
okay, which was right after the Civil Rights Bill. And so the Civil Rights Bill, first of all, opened up a way to building a bigger black population in New Orleans as people moved in. Then you had the Voting Rights Bill. And so that was when a new type of black politics emerged that didn't center around the old ministers anymore, but these new organizations. And the first show of power, the first mayor to be elected by those black organizations was Moon Landrieu. He was the first mayor elected with a majority black vote. And so from the Landrieu election until into the 90s, that was sort of like the golden age for those organizations. And yes, they were on the wane by the time.
Although I would argue that the ministers always had a lot of power, but they shared the power with the organizations. Once the organization, I don't think the ministers ever fell out of favor, but before the organizations, all of black political power and influence was in the black churches, and then it became a shared power between the churches and the political organizations.
I think the minister's power was with older black voters. I think the newer black voters were behind those organizations.
Okay, well, let's talk about some elections, really, that sort of were the result of this changing landscape in politics post-Katrina.
Well, the city council, as I mentioned, was a big one in '06. You look at who got elected in '06, starting at large. Arnie Fielko came from the Saints, a business candidate who also was considered a civic leader because it's widely considered that he kept the Saints or helped keep the Saints in New Orleans. He and Paul Tagliabue, when Tom Benson clearly was trying to move them to San Antonio. Oliver Thomas, who was one of the few holdovers from the black political organizations, but Oliver was popular, enormously popular in black and white communities. He was just loved. But in District A, Shelley Madura came from the Neighborhood Association movement, Civic Association. Stacy Head in Council District B was a civic leader. In C, you had Jackie Clarkson, who had been around for a while, but she very much came out of the West Bank business and civic community. In D, you had a brand new council member who had just gotten elected right before Katrina in the person of Cynthia Hedge Morrell. She got reelected, and she came from the political class, as it were, because her husband is, and now her son is an elected official. And in E, I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Cynthia Willig Lewis, also from the political. But so you had three people who came from the political class, one of whom was beloved across all lines, and then four who came from the business and civic and neighborhood association. That's very much a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach.
I mean, you also had in that election, of course, you had some other factors, like it was difficult for some people to vote. I mean, there were extraordinary efforts made to allow people who were displaced to vote. But I mean, I think Stacey Head, for instance, benefited from the fact that Renee Gill-Pratt, who was part of the Bill Jefferson organization, you know, a lot of her voters, I think, didn't turn up.
And she didn't help herself by helping herself to a vehicle and all of a sudden gotten exposed.
I wrote that story, actually, and that didn't come out until after the election, which, you know, that started a whole federal probe and whatnot, but that voters didn't know about that. So
that came out afterwards?
Yeah.
And then, you're right, but there were a lot of displaced voters, and many of whom came back to vote for Ray Nagin, but maybe, as you often see in black and white precincts, a fall off on the down ballot elections. District B used to be a very solidly black district, and immediately after Katrina, it became almost 50-50. And Stacey Head, to her credit, had done a lot of civic work in the black neighborhoods in that district, and so she benefited from that, sort of toiling in the vineyards, as it were, as part of her civic engagement. She got a lot of black votes, and she
did. And I think Oliver Thomas supported her. I mean, there were. It wasn't. Yeah. I don't mean to suggest that she didn't get any votes, but I think that.
But under the old paradigm, when it was 65-35, she couldn't have won that seat.
Okay, I'm going to shift this conversation a little bit now over to Errol, and I know you wanted to talk about structural changes, and Gordon talked about it a little bit, but streamlining government, that was a result
just like as people were going back to remodeling their houses, and they say, well, look, as long as we're doing this, let's fix some things that were wrong to begin with. And I think there's a lot of that in looking at government. So there's a lot of changing in government that went on. First of all, the levy boards would change, especially Darlene's levy board said, look, we want a levy board that is concerned with levees and not building fountains and running airports, but it does that. And so they changed that, and they created another board just to deal with the non-flooding things. I think a major change, and this is one people have been talking about for years, but it had never been made, but with the assessor's office, politically, those 7 assessors could always prevent a change from being made, but this couldn't happen this time. And so they got rid of them, and they have one assessor, and so that was a major change. There was talk about merging the criminal and the civil courts. And I mean, that was there, but that's the one thing. There was
legislation that was passed.
Yeah, that's the one thing that never happened. And but even though at the clerical level they were merged, and so it did bring about a whole feeling of change in government.
We also merged the 2 sheriffs. We had 2 sheriffs, 7 assessors, a levy board that was very political because you didn't have to have any qualifications. I think the really important change that they did on the levy board was not creating a regional levy board. That was important, but I think the real structural improvement was setting some professional standards, not minimum standards, but some significant standards of, we want people who are professionals, who have qualifications, an engineer,
who
knows something about flooding and hydrology and all that. Put some scientists and some engineers
before
on there.
The levy board,
it was just if you were friends with the local senator, you got on the levy board.
Well, it was like, we'll leave the levies to the Corps and we'll worry about the fun stuff.
But it was really civic engagement, citizen engagement that forced those changes.
Yeah. I wrote a column not long after Katrina about citizens for One Greater New Orleans, and I remember the headline was "Enraged and Engaged," and that really kind of, they were angry and frustrated, and as Gordon said, people started showing up at meetings, and that really drove a lot of that. In fact, it was Citizens for One Greater New Orleans that was the main driving force behind merging and setting standards for the levy boards. But they actually did pass legislation to merge the courts and the clerks. But as Gordon mentioned before the show, they kind of slow walked the implementation, and then sort of the steam ran out, so they undid that. But we did merge the sheriffs, the assessors, and the levy boards. And those things probably would have happened over a period of time, but it might have taken 20 years. And I think, as to use Errol's metaphor, as people were cleaning out their houses, they said, let's clean it all up. It made us make changes that might have taken 10 to 20 years, and we did them in 18 months.
There's a bit of a take the Band-Aid
And it wouldn't have
off,
happened,
yeah.
but
And there
for
were a few
Katrina.
offices that were merged into each other right before this, like the
Recorder of mortgages,
yeah,
register of conveyances. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, let's talk about our mayor. Ray Nagin at that time,
Our former mayor.
our former mayor, Ray Nagin, and his performance as mayor post Katrina. Gordon.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I think almost anybody would have struggled in these circumstances, and I think he struggled more than most would have. Partly because he had a real lack of experience in this kind of role, and there was a lot being asked of him. And I think he didn't have a great team around him. He wasn't getting a lot of great advice, and suddenly, he's in charge of trying to fix, as he put it, the biggest natural disaster to ever we've ever
like
seen
that,
in this
yeah.
country or something. But I mean, so if you look at what happened immediately before and after the storm, I think it didn't go well. Obviously, just about everything that went wrong could have. They didn't have a plan for getting people out. He didn't order an evacuation as early as he probably should have. There were all kinds of things you could find to criticize, but if you give, I think the thing that most people will remember not fondly about Ray Nagin is this feeling that he didn't, that he disengaged, particularly after the election. I think in the time between the immediate aftermath of the storm and his re-election, he had the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. He was sort of entertaining all these big discussions, and seemed like he was taking all these things seriously. You can take issue with how different things were presented, and as I mentioned before, how he sort of introduced some scary ideas and then sort of ran against them. But it seemed like once he got reelected, he went into this, he started touring around the country. He seemed to lose interest in governing. He had sort of a ragtag team of advisors around him. People came and went. He would restructure the government every few months and have a new person who was over these 10 departments, and then they'd be gone 6 months later. I mean, you remember these people like Donna Adkisson, for instance, just to pick a random name.
Yeah.
She was somebody who we never heard of, who they brought her in, and she was going to run half of the city government, and she seemed way over her head, and then 8 months later she was gone.
Well, Nagin himself was in way over his head, even from the get-go, except that had Katrina not happened, he would have been reelected without any major opponent, because New Orleans was a city that was complacent. We were just kind of coasting along, and we were happy to have Ray Nagin. He was kind of a feel-good mayor. Nothing really great was happening, but nothing real bad was happening, and he made a lot of people feel okay. There were people who didn't like him, but his popularity was still like in the high 60s or 70s.
People really bought into the idea that he was
a businessman.
He was a businessman and not a
the
politician.
problem is he ran as an outsider, and he governed like an outsider. And he should serve as a perpetual reminder that you can't take the politics out of politics. He shunned politics so much that he never formed any relationships with council members or with legislators. And when something like Katrina happens, a mayor really needs to draw upon his or her relationships with the rest of the political class to pull together a team and get things done politically. Well, all the politicians didn't trust Nagin. He didn't trust them. There was no cooperation. It was just open warfare. And he was way over his head.
And of course now he's a federal
and it
president.
showed. So he became, as citizens were getting engaged, he became disengaged, and the result was a disaster.
Someone else you wanted to talk about, Errol, was Oliver Thomas.
Well, with all of this and with all the changes, what happened to Oliver Thomas just changed the equation so much, because as you mentioned, how popular he was. He was everybody's vision of the next mayor, either through the next election. But remember, a lot of people were predicting that Nagin might resign, that he might run for Congress, or that he might get some kind of job or something. Some people were thinking that Nagin would leave the mayor's office, and so Oliver Thomas would become mayor that way. But clearly, for the next mayor's election, and then when he got into the trouble and wound up going to prison, that just changed everybody. It certainly hurt a lot.
It actually broke people's hearts.
It actually
made
did,
people
because
sad,
because
he was actually loved. There were very few politicians, black or white, who were not only respected but also loved by black and white citizens in equal. He got more votes than Ray Nagin. He got more votes than anybody in the election of 06.
I remember seeing him on the streets at that time when people were starting to come back from Katrina, and he was complaining that he had a lot of damage personally he was dealing with, but he was having to do Nagin's job, that he was going back and forth to Baton Rouge because he says they're just incompetent, they can't do it, and so they can't have it. But when Thomas got into trouble, just think how it changed the politics. One, it created a vacancy for his at-large seat, which Jackie Clarkson won, and that ended the whole tradition of one black and one white.
That's actually when you went to having 5 whites on the council versus 2. It had been 4-3 before that.
Okay. And then it really, to me, he was odds on to be elected the next mayor.
And it took a lot of steam out of the black community's push to elect a black mayor, because he was going to be the one. And it showed that this is kind of a generational thing. As the black political organizations fell out of favor or lost their power, and they were no longer producing a class of future leaders every 6 or 8, 10 years, there was no bench in the black political community.
There was no
after Oliver, there was nobody left who was, ready to step up or willing to step up. And, Reagan ran a race about race, as they said in 06. And after 4 more years of Nagin's incompetence, it was like the black community did a great big, okay, my bad, we're going with Mitch, and he won with an historic vote in the black and white communities. No mayor has ever done that before in an open race, getting a supermajority of black and white votes. It was always somebody would get a supermajority among one and maybe 20 to 25% among the other and win.
Well, Clancy, in that second race when Nagin ran for re-election against Mitch Landrieu, and yes, he carried the black vote, but he also got, remember that substantial
he got
white uptown
black. He got uptown Republican votes, and that came, I've had many people tell, that came from the White House. They said, we'd rather deal with Ray. And I remember Republicans uptown, Rob Kuig endorsed Ray Nagin. And the whisper campaign uptown among the Republican whites was, we'd rather have 4 more years of Ray than 8 years of Mitch. As it turns out, they've now had both.
And so let's talk about Mitch, Mayor Landrieu, and post-Katrina politics for him. Both of you guys, why don't you chime in on that?
Mitch Landrieu, before 06, was seen as kind of a John Bro on the local level. He was a conciliator who could bring people together. He could talk to the Republicans, he could talk to the blacks, he could talk to the whites, whatever. He took that defeat to Ray Nagin in 06 really, really hard. And a lot of people I know who know him very well said it changed him. He became much less conciliatory and much more hard-headed, much more the guy we know today. And his critics say he's a my way or the highway kind of guy. Very headstrong and broaches there's not a lot of cross discussion, I don't think, in his staff meetings. Whereas Dutch Morial used to invite people to disagree with him. He liked having his ideas tested. Mitch does not like his ideas to be tested, I don't think. This is what I'm going to do, everybody get on board or get out of the way. And I think the election of 06, as I see it, that produced that kind of change in him.
Gordon?
I wouldn't disagree with. I don't know exactly what he was like before. I didn't have a lot of dealings with him before, but that seems fairly on point for how things are now. I guess I would add, I think the upside of Mitch Landrieu, that people got a little bit of what they were looking for, which was sort of the competence part. I think there's a lot of debate about whether he's pursuing all the right policies, but I think the part where people give him credit generally is for getting the most money we could out of FEMA and the federal government and actually spending it, getting projects going, fixing streets, fixing buildings, those kinds of things.
Yeah, the recovery had been delayed. The recovery really got traction and speed under Mitch, and we got to point that out.
And his staff is noticeably more competent.
Yes.
And again, there's plenty of room for debate about whether he's pursuing the right policies on everything from, people think he's not doing enough about increasing inequality in the city, gentrification, all kinds of things, and those are worthwhile debates. But I think the thing—
You can have those debates in any city.
Right, but I think the thing that there's probably fairly widespread agreement on the people who are watching City Hall is that they're more able to get whatever it is they're trying to do done.
Absolutely.
When he was first elected that day, there was never as much of a feel-good election as that. Because if you remember, after all the division and all the problems, he was elected, a white mayor elected with the black vote and the white vote. He carried the black vote and the white vote. And so the city was crazy about that because it was good. The city was united behind that election. Plus, it was the day before the Saints were in the Super Bowl.
That's right.
So it was just like
that was a real euphoric weekend.
Yeah.
And in fact, you talk about Gordon, you hit on the right note of competence. Mitch's mantra in that race in 2010 was, I know what to do and I know how to do it. Mm-hmm. That was his opening and closing line in a debate, in a presentation, at the coffees, at the fundraisers, everything.
Okay.
And he did. He did know what to do. He knows how to do it. The problem is if you disagree with him, too bad.
Okay, I'm going to now ask you guys, we seem to all agree that there has been change over this past 10 years in the political landscape and also citizen engagement. What do you see for the next 10 years? Errol?
Okay. Well, I think with the emerging black middle class, and there's going to be less of a division between black and white voting, that the black middle class and the white middle class going to have more in common, and they're going to be more of a block. There's going to always be somebody against somebody, but I think the black-white part of it's going to break down more over the next 10 years.
Clarence?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, Nagin's election note, too, was more about economics. It was he got the black middle class and the white middle class. And I think we're going to come back to that. But I think we're going to see, I hate to say it, it's not an emerging black middle class because it emerged in the 90s. It's there. It's going to be growing. But I think what we're going to see is a generational change. We're going to see a younger generation. We're already seeing a younger generation of black professionals get involved in politics. And it's now going to be, just as their white counterparts in '06, it's going to be the business, civic, and neighborhood organizations in black neighborhoods and black civic groups and professional groups that produce the next generation of black political leaders.
Gordon?
I mean, I think we probably will see a continuing diminishment of race as being the most important thing in politics, the way it used to be, and we'll see more. I think if we continue to see the kind of demographic changes we're seeing, which is to say more young millennials and yuppies, whatever you want to call them, young people of means moving into the city, that's going to continue to change our politics in that direction. I think race isn't important to those people, but other things are. I guess a question I have is whether we're going to hit some sort of a tension point where people who are longtime residents of the city who feel like they're being priced out of the city and those kinds of things, whether they're going to sort of that tension out there, and whether that's going to come to a head.
All right, interesting discussion, guys. Thanks so much for being here. It's hard to believe 10 years post-Katrina, huh? That we're talking about changing political landscape in New Orleans. All right, thanks a lot for being here. Thanks you guys for joining us also, and have a very good and safe Labor Day weekend, and we'll see you next week.